Okay. Hey, can I have your attention, please? For those who don't know me, I'm Ira Hyman. I'm a professor of psychology, and I have the honor of introducing our keynote speaker for PsychFest, Dr. Maddie Jalbert. But before I do that, I have a couple of business things to take care of. The first is that I want us to start with the land acknowledgement. Western Washington University's main campus is situated on the ancestral homelands of the Coast Salish peoples, who have lived in the Salish Sea Basin all throughout the San Juan Islands and the North Cascades watershed from time immemorial. We express our deepest respect and gratitude to our indigenous neighbors for their enduring care and protection of our shared lands and waterways. The Psychology Department and Western Washington University Alumni Association are excited to welcome those of you in the room and those of you on the Zoom to our keynote address for today's PsychFest. And some of the people are online, and I just want to note for those of you who are online, if you've submitted questions online, we will hopefully get to those during the Q&A today. And if you want to submit questions during the talk, you should be able to find the Q&A button down at the bottom to allow you to submit a question, and we will hopefully get Dr. Jalbert to answer those during as many of those as we can during the Q&A time today. And now I get to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Maddie Jalbert. Dr. Jalbert received her PhD at the University of Southern California, and much of her research has centered on how people make judgments of truth, particularly in real-world situations. I actually consider Maddie to be one of the leading experts on truth judgments out there in the world today. And actually, for those of you who are students in my class, you know this because we've read some of her papers in our class this term. And Dr. Jalbert is currently a postdoctoral scholar at University of Washington Center for an Informed Public. This is a large interdisciplinary group of researchers. And with this group, Dr. Jalbert is working on the problem of the spread of misinformation, both in terms of why people adopt misinformation and in terms of how to disrupt the spread and adoption of disinformation. In essence, I like to think that Maddie is one of the people on the front line trying to save democracy. And I mean that not lightly at all. I mean that quite seriously. We cannot solve the major problems facing us in our world today if we can't even agree on the base reality. And disinformation has made it very hard for us to agree on those things, and the work that Dr. Jalbert is doing is really important for that. But in introducing Dr. Jalbert, I want to note one special feature that makes me particularly happy. Maddie Jalbert received her undergraduate degree here at Western Washington University in the behavioral neuroscience program. And she and I have collaborated on several research projects over the years. And the best part is that Dr. Jalbert's first formal academic talk was given at PsychFest a few years ago, but it was at PsychFest that she gave her first formal academic talk. So I'm really incredibly happy to introduce my friend and my colleague, Dr. Maddie Jalbert, who will give a talk on her work entitled Exploring Why We Fall for Misinformation and What We Can Do About It.
That was a very nice introduction. I'm very excited to be here. Yeah, 7 years ago was when I gave my first talk here at PsychFest. And coming back here, it's been so great to see all of the undergraduate research going on and master's research. And yeah, let me know if perfect. And I'm just very thankful for the education I had at Western and for Ira. Ira is the reason that I got into grad school. Ira is the reason I have my current position. He sent along a job posting. And so it's just been really wonderful to come back and see all my old professors and to be able to share some of my new research. So today I'm going to be talking about why we fall for misinformation and what we can do about it. There's going to be two parts to this talk. The first half, I'm going to do just a more broad review of what we know about why we believe information and misinformation. And then I'm going to shift to talking about some research that I've been doing with some colleagues looking at some possible interventions. And so if you have any just clarifying questions during, go ahead and ask. But then at the end, there'll be a Q&A. Okay, so how do we decide if something is true? And so because I like to have an example to pull through, I'm going to show a claim here. And this is something that I was told when I first started at Western Washington, which is that Western Washington is a clothing optional campus. You may have heard this. I think that it's something that people are told during orientation. And so I want you to think about how you might decide if this is true. One way you might go about this is relying on the content of the information. So thinking really carefully about what you know about Western, what you know about laws around clothing. Another way you can judge truth is by going with whether or not something feels true. So you hear people say that feels true, that seems true, talking about gut feelings. And I'm really interested in what makes things feel true. So when we think about feelings of truth, one of the main things that people are interested in is something called ease of processing. And so information can feel easy or difficult to process. So you can imagine if you came across this research article and you're trying to read it, it's using language you're not familiar with, it's got this diagram going on, that might feel really difficult to process this information. Alternatively, you might be scrolling through BuzzFeed and something like this, health and fitness, this is going to feel really easy to process. And one of the things that we know is that when information feels easier to process, it also feels more true. And sometimes that ease of processing can be a valid cue for truth. So something might feel easy to process because the arguments flow logically, it's coherent. It might feel easy to process because it's consistent with what you already know. It might feel easy to process because you heard it from a credible source. But sometimes processing ease can result from factors that are unrelated to truth. So I'm going to give you some examples now. And there's lots more besides these. But one thing that can make information feel easier to process is print font. So if you say, read this claim in this easy to read print font, compared to this difficult to read print font, there's some work that finds that people are more accepting of information, less critical of it when it's in an easier to read print font. The audio quality. So when information is shared in easier to hear audio quality, it also seems like higher quality information. So in one study, participants were asked to listen to TED Talks, and they either got the TED Talks in very clear audio or in audio that just had a lot of background noise, and they could still understand the talk. But when it was in the worst audio quality, they thought the quality of the research was worse and that the researcher wasn't as good of a researcher. So I hope that everyone who is listening on Zoom has good audio. And then the presence of photos. So merely presenting a photo that is related to the claim, even if it doesn't provide any additional evidence, can make that claim seem more true. And then the last example, which is my favorite, is repetition. So just seeing the same claim over and over again makes it seem more true. And this is called the illusory truth effect in research. And this effect compared to the other effects is much larger. So the effects of things like print font and photos tend to be rather small. Repetition tends to be particularly large. All right, so shifting gears a little bit, I am going to show you a question here in a second, and I want all of you to think of the answer. The answer is a number, and you can hold up fingers for your answer, or if you're online, just think of it in your head. How many animals of each kind did Moses take on the ark? So go ahead and hold up some fingers. All right, I'm seeing a lot of twos. I'm seeing mostly twos for people on Zoom. I would say about 80% twos and some zeros. For those of you who had said two, you're wrong. You probably know that Noah is the one with the ark, not Moses. Yeah, so yeah. And so I tricked a lot of people. This is a good. So this is something that's called the Moses illusion. It's got a name. And it segues nicely into talking about intuitive versus analytical processing. So generally, we assume that information's true. That's our default setting. And so we tend to nod along if things feel right. And so when you saw that question, it all felt like it fit together. And so you just kind of nodded along and gave the answer that came to mind immediately. Oftentimes this works really well but there are times in which it doesn't work well. On the other hand, analytical processing requires motivation and cognitive resources. It's more effortful, and so we don't tend to do it as often. However, there can be reasons for people to switch to this analytical processing. Distrust or suspicion are one of the main reasons. So something might feel wrong and feel off. You might be warned, hey, something here is off, pay attention. You might be suspicious for someone's motives. So typically there needs to be this reason to switch from that intuitive to analytical processing. So now we're going to shift gears again. And so we've talked generally about how people use feelings to judge truth, but now I'm going to talk more specifically about the criteria that people can draw on when making judgments of truth. So there's generally 5 main truth criteria that people use. People typically rely on some of these, but not all of these. The first one is compatibility. So is the information compatible with other things that I know? Coherence. Is the information internally coherent? Does it hang together correctly? Credibility. Does it come from a credible source? Consensus. Do other people believe it? And evidence. Is there supporting evidence? So these are typically, when you're deciding if something's true, most things fall into these 5 categories. And what's important to note is that you can use intuitive or analytical processing to evaluate each of these criteria. So that sounds a little bit complex, so I'm going to give you some examples. So say you're trying to figure out, do other people believe this information? You can do this intuitively by asking, does it feel familiar? Because if something feels familiar, I've probably heard it before, it's probably something lots of other people believe. And so you can just go, oh, it feels familiar, lots of people believe it. That's a good indication that it's true. A more analytical evaluation would be something more like asking, what do my friends say? What do opinion polls say? So actually going through and seeing, is this something other people believe? And then looking at credibility, does it come from a credible source? An intuitive evaluation might be something like, does the source feel familiar and trustworthy? A more analytical evaluation might be, does the source have relevant expertise? Does the source have any other vested interests? And one thing that's important to note with this is that the analytical evaluation doesn't always necessarily get you to the truth, because these criteria are subjective. So what relevant expertise is subjective, who you find credible. And so it's not always the case that going through the analytical process gets you to the truth. It does depend on what you as an individual consider to be things that are compelling. Oh, and I had one more here. Is the source trustworthy? Okay, so now, given all of that, why might we believe misinformation? Because assuming information is true is the default. There may not be cues to analyze information more carefully. So especially when you're in settings where everything feels right, it feels familiar, there's really no reason to turn your guard up. Misinformation may feel easy to process. And it may meet or feel like it meets truth criteria, like source credibility or social consensus. So it may seem like lots of people believe the misinformation. It may seem like it comes from a credible source. It may seem like there's evidence. And so it's meeting those truth criteria. We also may not always remember or use source information. And so we go more with these feelings. And also we may not have a better explanation. And so even if it's the case where you may be motivated to analytically assess something, if you don't have any extra information to draw on, that's when you tend to go more with feelings. Since if you don't have more information, that's when you tend to rely more on those feelings. So now we've talked a lot about believing misinformation. Now the question is, why do we share misinformation? And so you might assume that the reasons that people believe misinformation are the same reasons why people share misinformation. But it's the case that there's many reasons why people may read and share information. It might be to inform others, but people may have other goals in sharing information. It might be for entertainment, to build social bonds, to feel like part of a group. And this is a lot of work that Ira Hyman's done in his early work in terms of when people are remembering with others. So it's not always the case when you're sharing things and remembering things that making sure every single fact matches onto reality is the primary goal. And in many cases, the truth of the information may not even be relevant to the conversation. So say if you're sharing this claim, Western Washington is a clothing optional campus, you might not actually care so much if this is true or not. You may want to share it for entertainment because it's funny to kind of connect with your peers. So given all of this, I'm going to give now some very broad recommendations for what you can do. So one recommendation is to just draw attention to truth when misinformation might be present. So just merely alerting people, hey, be careful, there might be some false information. That can be one way to just get people to shift from just the default of nodding along to being more careful. And the other thing you can do is you can make the truth feel true. And so all the same things that can make misinformation seem true can also make true information seem more true. And so you can appeal to truth criteria when you're sharing the truth. So you presenting factual information in a way that's compatible with the audience's prior knowledge is really important. Especially if you're trying to correct information or update someone's belief. It's harder to accept information when it doesn't match with what you already know. So giving people, hey, this is why that prior information you got, why it was shared, why it's incorrect, and here now is the update. Doing that step and connecting the two can be really useful. Making your story coherent, so that builds off of what I just said. People really like stories. They like to have a full explanation. And so if you can give people a full story and explanation, that can be really helpful. And then drawing attention to the credibility of the information source. And if you're getting information that's been shared by different sources, you can think about what source might that person find credible, because credibility is subjective. But if you have factual information from a credible source, sharing the source can be compelling. And also pointing to when there's consensus for that information. So there's a lot of recent research coming out around vaccination attitudes. And one thing that can be effective is pointing to experts' consensus around vaccination. And if you can point to consensus to vaccination, that can be one way to help shift behaviors, just by not by even convincing people about what they should do, but rather just by sharing what people are doing. And then also sharing evidence for your claims. Okay. So I know you're all dying to know, is this true or false? It's not true. I ran cross country here and I was looking into this myth and I came across this nice article from a couple years ago. I can confirm that people on the cross country team like to do this a lot, and they were cited. Unfortunately, they found out that this was not true. And in this article, had this myth debunked. It's not a clothing optional campus. The information I was told was that as long as you alert your professors beforehand, you can show up to class naked, or as long as you tell campus police. I don't know if that's a myth that's still spreading, no? I don't know. That is indeed, yeah. Other people have heard this. That's indeed not the case. Wear your clothes to campus. Okay. So I'm going to now shift to part 2 of the talk, which is going into some more research that I've been working on recently with some colleagues at the Center for an Informed Public. And so one of the main areas they're looking to address is the spread of online misinformation. And one thing that people often want to know is what can they do when they come across misinformation online? So the question here is, what can users do to encounter misinformation online to reduce its impact? And the scope here is thinking about the misinformation's impact on other people. So this talk will focus not on the original poster, but how do you then reduce the effect of the misinformation from spreading to other people? Fact checks can be effective, and that's one of the more commonly suggested strategies. So if you see misinformation, share a fact check, correct the person. And we know that these can be effective, and they can be effective when they come from users. But fact checks take time and effort. You have to go and you have to search and you have to find it. Not all information is fact checkable. So you can think about really broad claims or these anecdotal stories where people say that something happened to them. A lot of cases around election and election fraud and voting, a lot of these were kind of anecdotal stories. And users may also be hesitant to correct peers, especially publicly. I know that I personally, like, when you're posting something on social media and you know that your friends and family are going to see it, you may not want to directly call out someone in this way. And so given the limitation of some of these fact checks, groups have started to develop alternative strategies. And so I was lucky enough to be introduced to a group called Democracy Yethu, and they're an NGO in South Africa, and they're run through this broader center called the Center for Analytics and Behavioral Change. And so there's a graduate student that I've been working with, Morgan Wack, who is the one who connected me to this group. And they're doing very, very cool work addressing the spread of election misinformation. And what they had done was developed an intervention. And it was based on the researchers' experience in dialogue facilitation. And what they did was they recruited volunteers and they trained them specifically to respond to posts containing misinformation in a certain way. And then they would get together and they would do, they would go ahead and then post onto these specific posts containing misinformation. And they followed this guidebook. And so this group was saying, they came to us and they said, hey, we're seeing that this approach is working, but we don't have any actual evidence of it. We don't have any research to point to. So we'd love if you could help us and test it out. And so we took a look at some of the example replies. So I had this guidebook with example replies, and there was a subset of them that really stuck out to me. And so here are some of them. Have you ever been there? How do you know that? Do you have any proof of what you're saying? Where is the evidence for that? So a lot of these responses, they weren't trying to fact check or call people out, but they were really asking these questions and seeing them. And you might notice a lot of them have similarities to those truth criteria that I was talking about. And so we noticed that many of the example replies were drawing attention to truth. And there's an area in the field of psychology that's looking at, there's a lot of people doing misinformation interventions. And it reminded us of some of them that are involved in shifting attention to accuracy. And so there's been research where in this study, this pausing study, they find that if people are asked before they share information how they know it's true or false, that can reduce the make people less likely to share misinformation. Or there's an area of they call them accuracy nudges. If you ask people to rate the truth of one headline, then that can make people less likely to share future headlines. And then there's also some work that I've been involved in, that I led, in which when you simply warn people, hey, there's some false information, that can make them less likely to believe it when they encounter it later. So it can reduce that illusory truth effect. And so all of these things, kind of the idea behind them is they're shifting people from just assuming information's true to considering the information's truth. And we thought a lot of these user replies might be acting in a similar way. Another nice thing about these replies is they also communicate something about social consensus. So if you see a post online and there aren't any replies, or all of the replies are just kind of things that are consistent with the post, that might communicate that there's consensus with people. But having these kind of questioning responses can indicate that actually this isn't information that everyone agrees with. There's some lack of consensus. So we thought what they were doing was really smart. And we decided to then do some experimental lab studies to test the use of some of these. And we decided to name these kind of subset of questions truth queries. So we define truth queries as questions that appeal to truth or truth criteria. So those 5 criteria that you saw earlier. And our question here was, can social truth queries posted by users reduce the impact of false information posted online? And by impact, we were interested both in belief and also people's likelihood of sharing the information. And we conducted 3 experiments to test this. So I'm gonna do an overview of those 3 studies. They all followed a very similar design, so I'll describe them all together and then show you the results together. So the methods we used Twitter users that were on mTurk and prolific. We recruited Twitter users because we used tweets as our stimuli. And these participants were asked to view a series of tweets. They were told to imagine that they were using Twitter and they came across these posts. And then they rated truth or sharing for each of them. And I'll show you an example in a second. But the truth scale looked like this. So they were rating the posts from definitely true to definitely false. And then for sharing, they were asked how likely they would be to share the post from extremely unlikely to extremely likely. So the tweets. We created several tweets that contained false information, and we varied them. So we had 8 of these in the first study, and then 6, and then 24. And we also had fillers that contained true information. And the content of the tweets were myths that were fact-checked on Snopes or similar fact-checking websites. And we chose them so that they weren't things that were obviously true or false. So you wouldn't see them and just know off the bat, this is definitely true or this is definitely false. So now we get an example. So here is one that we used where the myth was that hand sanitizer can spontaneously combust if left in a hot car. That was the myth. So we turned them into posts and we created these tweets. So these aren't real people. So we came up with the names based on common names from the census, and we used handles that weren't in use. And we also selected profile photos from stock images. So going into psychology, I didn't know I was going to be making fake social media posts and people. So it was a really fun task, but also definitely a little tricky. Here's another example. So this one's talking about how Mother's Day has less crime than any other day of the year. Yeah. This is much easier to make than you would hope that it would be. It's very easy. And so then participants saw these tweets and they appeared in one of 3 reply conditions. So people were seeing tweets in all of these conditions mixed together. So they might see it with no reply, which is what you just saw was an example of that. They might see it with a user reply containing a truth query. And then in our second 2 studies, we also included a neutral reply unrelated to truth. We wanted to check that if we got an effect of the reply, it wasn't just the mere presence of a reply, but rather something specific about the truth queries. So we also included these neutral replies. You'll see an example in a second. So here's an example of the truth queries. This person then is responding, how do you know this is true? Here's another example on the Mother's Day one. What evidence is there for that? And so in the first 2 studies, we always posted the same truth query with the same tweet. So we had it so that tweet that you just saw would always appear with the same response from the same user. In the third study, we more systematically tested different truth queries. And so the same tweet could appear with different truth queries for different people. And we also had it so that in doing that, the same truth query would appear on different tweets. So we wanted to make sure it wasn't something specific about that truth query pairing, but see if a variety of truth queries would be effective on a variety of tweets. This wasn't fully counterbalanced, but we did counterbalance such that there was variation. So it ended up that each truth query could appear with 6 different tweets. And so what you'll also see then is us looking at a comparison of how these different truth queries worked compared to each other. Okay. And then I'm going to show you now the specific truth queries. So this is experiment 3 when we did that more systematic testing. And so you'll see these truth criteria that you're familiar with. We didn't use all of them, but we chose some of them. And then what we did is we created these truth queries that would appeal to those specific criteria. And so thinking about compatibility, we made a question, does this make sense given everything else you know? Credibility, we did a couple that fit with credibility. So we created these queries, and then we also had ones that were more general. Why would that be the case? How do you know this is true? So we wanted a variety, and also just to get a sense of, is it that specific types of ones are working better, or do a variety of them work? Okay, and then the neutral reply, unrelated to truth. Here's an example. So it'd be the same user, but here this person's complaining about another summer without AC, which I agree with. And then this person, Andy, now saying, thanks for reminding me I need to call my mom. Okay, so now we're going to see some data. And I'm going to show you data from the 3 studies together. And so first, I'm going to show you the average ratings of the tweets that appeared with no replies. And to orient you, higher here means more true. And so higher means more true. And so here's what we had at our baseline. And then what we were hoping is that the presence of the truth queries on the false information would reduce ratings of truth. So we hope that the bars here are lower. And they were indeed, and this was significant across the 3 studies. And then what we wanted to see is it just the truth queries that are reducing it, or is it any comment? So what we were hoping here is that the neutral replies would not have the same effect. And we found that was the case. So it's really the truth queries that were reducing truth. We also did a mini meta-analysis. So what we did is that we combined across the 3 studies to get an average effect size. And what we found was across the 3 studies, there was an effect size, a Cohen's d of 0.33, which is like a small to medium effect, but a very consistent effect across the 3 studies, which was very exciting. We then did the same thing with sharing ratings. So here, higher means people were saying that they were more likely to share. And here are our baselines, and we were hoping the truth queries would also reduce people's ratings of sharing likelihood. We found that was the case as well across the 3 studies. And similarly, the neutral replies didn't have that effect. We did a same analysis here, and here we had still a significant effect, Cohen's d of 0.16. One thing to note here is that people's sharing ratings at baseline were lower. So this was a 1 to 6 scale. So already people tended to be lower on saying that they would share these. And so we might expect that if people are less likely to share things already, then these truth queries wouldn't have as much of an impact as with the truth ratings, where people were more in the middle of truth. Okay, so this looks a little bit complicated, but then we also broke things down by the individual truth queries. And so what you're seeing here, that dotted line, that's like if there was no effect. So here we're comparing the truth ratings when there was a truth query versus no reply. So if that dot and the line are to the left of the dotted line, that means that they reduced. So they reduced truth or reduced sharing. So we'd hope that things are to the left. And we found that overall that was the case. Everything was in that right direction. It's hard to specifically compare things because some things appeared with different tweets, but we just wanted an overall sense. Is it just a few of these queries that are really driving the effects, or are there a variety of these questions that can work? And here our takeaway was that generally it seems like all of the truth queries are acting in the same direction, and many of them are working. So it's not just 1 or 2 specific questions. So that was also very exciting and nice to know that it wasn't just very specific ones that were driving this. Okay, so now I'm going to shift gears. So we did those 3 lab studies, and those are now available as a preprint. We're trying to get that work published. But that graduate student that I worked with, Morgan, he has a lot of interest in the Global South and in misinformation around the Global South. And so one thing that he wanted to do is test the impact of these truth queries with political information in a Kenyan context. And so we were doing some work around the Kenya 2022 election, which was last August. And in this election going into it, things seemed like they were pretty good. So William Ruto and Raila Odinga were the 2 main candidates. And Odinga was the one who was predicted to win. And what happened was that the results were really close, and then Ruto ended up winning the election, which led to a lot of chaos and a lot of misinformation being spread and things playing out very similar to the US election. And so we were watching this and thinking that this would be then a good place to test our truth queries in this context. So this is a very different context. It's with polarized information. And in a Kenyan population. And so as part of this work, what Morgan did was he took a set of tweets that had been shared around the Kenya election. So this is a set of 2 million tweets. around the Kenya election. And then he took a subset of 3,000 of them that were related to that were misinformation around the Kenya election. And then what he did is he broke them down into different types of claims. So one of the things with we talked about already is that not all information can be fact checkable. So his question was, well, how much of this information could be fact checkable? And so he had different categories. So there's unspecified claims. And so those are like very broad claims like, oh, the election was rigged. And that's something that's really difficult to fact check because there's not just one thing there's not specific information that can fact check it. Unprovable claims are something like those anecdotal claims where it's like, oh, like my friend saw this or I saw that. And so what he was finding then out of all the information was only about 39% of it were things that could feasibly be fact checked. And then of those, he looked to see how many of them actually had a fact check that would have been available around that time. And out of that, only 38% of them could have feasibly been fact checked. And so this was some rationale behind the idea of fact checking being something that can work, but there's a large amount of information that can't be fact checked. And so that would give a reason to have these other strategies for addressing that information. So that was just a bit of background. And so then what we did was we ran a truth query study, and we conducted this in October of 2022. So this was like a couple months after the election. And so, but there was still a large amount of misinformation being spread. And the stimuli we used, and so this time we used Facebook posts because most people there, they have phones and they have access to Facebook. And so that's the main form of social media. And we created Facebook posts that were based on misinformation spread during the Kenya election. So they were directly adapted from tweets, so actual tweets with misinformation that had been shared. And we used unspecified and unprovable claims. So basically the ones where you couldn't have done a fact check for them. And the participants, and so this is thanks to Morgan, we got 4,000 Kenyans, and we primarily recruited through Facebook ads. And so they were recruited through the ads and they got paid in airtime. So what they use for phone data, which is used like currency. And we got a lot of really eager, willing participants that very high quality data. So this is very exciting. And the study was available in English and Swahili, although the vast majority of participants took it in English. And so participants rated 8 Facebook posts, half of them favoring Ruto and half of them favoring Odinga. And so here's an example. Similarly, we use names that were based on common names in Kenya and with profiles that were stock images. And this is an example of what one may look like. And then participants here rated either information accuracy, their intent to share, or also the trustworthiness of the poster. One of the ideas with this is that oftentimes online, the people who are the ones spreading misinformation share an outsourced amount of misinformation. So a lot of the misinformation comes from just a few users. And so one thing is whether these truth queries would impact people's perception of the user's trustworthiness. And so posts here just appeared either with or without a truth query. And here we only used 4 truth queries. So these were ones that we chose, and Morgan was the one leading this, and he made one slight adjustment, which is kind of funny, is that instead of do other people believe this, he added do other people actually believe this, which I'll come back to later. But he made, there are some slight tweaks, but similar types of queries. Okay, so now I'm going to show you the results. And so I guess as I'm saying this, as a reminder, this is like very difficult misinformation to correct because it had already been spreading for 2 months and people had very set views at that point. And so looking at this accuracy rating, this was significant, but it was a very small effect if you look at all participants. So there's a very small effect of the truth queries on reducing belief in the misinformation. Sharing and trustworthiness had a similar pattern, but these actually didn't reach significance across all people, which is maybe not the most surprising given it's really hard to correct those types of beliefs when they've really been established. But then what Morgan decided to do, which was really smart, was look at just the people who at baseline were the most susceptible. So the people who at baseline were the most likely to believe the misinformation when it appeared without a truth query, were the most likely to share the misinformation when it appeared without a truth query, and then thought that the users were most trustworthy without a truth query. And he defined this as people who were 1 standard deviation above the mean. And so when we look at just these people, we actually find a really big effect across the board. And so one way to look about this is if people are already generally not believing things, not likely to share things, and not trusting as much, the truth queries may not have as big of an impact. But the people who are the ones generally who are highest, those might be the people who are most affected by these truth queries. So I think looking into this a bit more, but we thought that this was a nice thing. And I actually looked back at the data from the studies that I just presented, and there was a similar pattern in that the people who at baseline had the highest belief in sharing were also the people who had a bigger impact from the truth queries. Yes. And then we've looked at so far across all participants, was there an effect? Was this moderated by people's political orientation, since half were pro and pro the other? We actually find that generally it worked similarly well, or similarly across both of them, although that's not looking at the most susceptible people. We still have to do that analysis. But it was nice that for at least accuracy across all participants, it was working similarly for both posts that were consistent with people's political orientation and opposite. Okay, so now some general discussion. So we find initial evidence for truth queries as this flexible user-driven strategy for addressing online misinformation. And there are several reasons we think it might be effective. One is that attention to accuracy, so just getting people to consider truth when they may not otherwise, and think about truth before they're sharing. It also may communicate a lack of social consensus, and so that being a truth criteria in and of itself, having these questions can communicate that consensus. And there also may be some social presentation goals. So if you are deciding if you want to share a post, even if you believe the post, if the post comes with someone questioning it, you may not want to share it, because why would I share something that then has other people calling it out? And so that might be a component to this as well. And we also found that a broad range of truth queries worked. So it's not just that specific questions were effective, a range of them did. And then also we found that truth queries seem to be the most effective for the people who at baseline are most susceptible. Let's see. And I want to just add on this slide with the initial evidence. This backs up the work that Democracy Youth is doing, which is one of the primary goals was to test their strategy. And so that was also encouraging. But there's still a lot of unknowns, so these were some initial studies. So there's other considerations. One of the primary ones being the impact on true information. So it may be the case that if people are asking these questions on true information, it may make people less likely to believe it and less likely to share it. And so given that, I want to be cautious about recommending that everyone go out and post truth queries and question everything. We think it's really nice in the context of this group where people are specifically trained to respond to a specific type of misinformation and they're keeping track of it. But thinking more about what kind of general recommendations to make to people before putting them out there is something that we want to do. Yes. But the same can be said also with things like other interventions, and even something like fact checking. Like you could fact check true information and make things up. So, but want to be careful with that. Also, the presence of other replies. So here we are just getting that one reply. It may depend on other replies, things like where in the comment order it is, how the conversation plays out. One thing that's nice is that we do have some data from the center who's running these studies. We have some of the posts that they've responded to, and some of them are single replies and some of them are kind of longer conversations. And what we'd like to do there is look at the impact of those replies on the poster's behavior before and after. So you've seen now just like other users' perceptions, but one thing might be that these replies can also make the person who originally shared less likely to share misinformation. So we have some of that data, and that we'd like to look actually at, when it's just one reply and one of these full conversations, but also testing that in the lab study as well, or lab setting as well. And also the specific affordances of the social media platform. So there are algorithms that prioritize posts that have a lot of engagement. So it might not make sense to post these questions if it then makes the post more likely to be seen by other people. So it might be something where the strategy is a good idea if a post already has a lot of engagement, or if it's likely to be seen. But if it's something where other people aren't seeing it, like maybe skip it. Comment order, I already mentioned. And then also whether comments appear with shared posts. So that's the idea of like, okay, maybe I won't share this if other people are questioning it, if the comment comes along with it. So lots of possibilities for follow-up. One area that we're already looking at, so the same organization that does the election misinformation also has a project called He Cares, which is focused on the spread of gender-based violence online. And so they're doing work on addressing like sexist posts, posts related to gender-based violence, and doing the similar dialoguing work. And so we'd also like to test some aspects of that as well, and have some studies that are in preparation. But also we're very interested in if other people have ideas, if there are people who want to collaborate. We think that there's a lot that could be looked at with these things. And so I'm also very interested in collaborating with other people and testing things further. And then the last thing is I just want to say thank you to, these are my collaborators on the social truth query work. Morgan, who I mentioned, Praga Arya, who is a graduate student at the University of Southern California, and Luke Williams, who just graduated just got his undergrad at Pomona College, and who will be starting grad school in school psychology at the University of Washington next year. I'll also mention Morgan also just graduated this week, so that Kenya work is part of his dissertation, and he just defended his dissertation a few days ago, and he's going to be a research scientist at Clemson University. So big shout out to all of them. And yeah, that's what I have, and I'm happy to take questions.
There's a lot of like my experience in the scientific community being based in quantitative methods, especially like the westernized, more colonial version and linear version of what the concept of truth means.
Yeah.
I'm wondering like what you defined in these studies as the concept of truth. Like, did you keep in account the qualitative aspects of truth and like personal truth, or are you going forward with more?
That's a really nice question. In these studies, we didn't specifically define truth, so it would be however participants themselves were interpreting truth, which could then be in these multiple different ways. Yes, and I'll say that this is how it's typically done in psych studies and like the cognitive psych studies, but I think that that's what you're saying like makes a lot of sense, because we haven't done are people assessing factual truth or kind of this more just pragmatic truth, or yeah, I don't have a good answer for you other than we left it open, but that's a really nice question. There's another question in front of you. Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. So that question was about what we were, how we were defining truth in our studies.
So disinformation is definitely a very relevant topic, but I feel like there's a related concept to it as well, like a sort of distrust in scientific institutions and like government-based sources of information. And kind of thinking about like the rise of conspiracy theorists over COVID. And I'm wondering how you would address that with your research based on like the ability to appear to a common credible source, or even like what is defined by evidence. I understand like fact checking and truth query are separate approaches, but the queries do kind of seem to go back to evidence and like things that would be are generally considered to be facts. So I'm wondering like how you would reach that seemingly related subset of people who don't agree on what is evidence.
Yeah, so this question is about how to address the group of people who disagree with what is evidence and the rise of conspiracy theories around COVID. And yes, it's a very big question. And I think, yeah, with a lot of these things, it makes it so that appealing to those truth criteria, so appealing to sources that you would find credible or evidence that you would find credible, doesn't necessarily work for everyone. I would say a really nice strategy there, social consensus tends to be something that you can still appeal to. Oftentimes in these factions or this misinformation, they're typically views that are held by the minority. But one problem is that they often get misrepresented in the media. And so people tend to then view them as being something that's more common than they actually are. And so I think one approach is, if you're talking about these groups or you're talking about that, you really put it into context of, here are just a few people that believe this, and then the majority of people are actually not endorsing that. And so we've done some work looking at this around vaccination behavior, and oftentimes headlines focus on, hey, here's the few people that didn't get vaccinated. Here are these people with anti-vax attitudes. Here are the 10 people that got fired because they didn't get vaccinated. But you could also frame it as, hey, look at all these thousands of people that kept their jobs because they got vaccinated, or these people that endorse vaccination. And so we did some work where when you show people those social consensus, then that can increase people's perceptions of how many people are vaccinated and have pro-vaccination beliefs, which can in turn, in some cases, increase people's own intent to vaccinate. So that's only like one very small piece you're asking. Like the question you ask is a really great one. But I'm more and more thinking about the route of social consensus rather than trying to directly argue with someone. And the other piece of this as well is oftentimes it's like you can't do something in one conversation. And so thinking about things that can, thinking about this as something that changes over time. But yeah, it's very difficult. Yeah. Yes.
I was wondering if you could, oh, by the way, I think this is a great program of research. You really need this. Can you say a little bit more about the social consensus criteria for truth, and how does that kind of I don't know, create a tension between conformity or maybe not wanting to conform? And I'm specifically thinking of like paradigm shifts that we've had in science. Like kind of like think about like Galileo and all the truth criteria. You're like, nope.
Yeah.
Right. So like how can we kind of reconcile these things?
So the questions around so social consensus and social consensus not always matching with other truth criteria and other evidence, and kind of how to reconcile that. Is that?
Yeah, that social consensus really draws on conformity.
Yeah, so social consensus drawing on conformity. That's a good question. I mean, I would say that it's the case for some areas where there's people may not want to conform or see it, and there are specific instances where yeah, I have to think about that. Most of the work in the, sorry, I think I might not be quite getting after.
Well, and I didn't really phrase the question very well, but I just think like maybe some people see that consensus as a way of conforming.
Yeah.
And they don't want to conform.
Yeah.
Or in some cases, the truth doesn't.
Yeah, so cases where the truth doesn't conform to the majority view, and cases in which people may not want to conform. Yeah. And so the instances I've been talking about where appealing to social consensus are ones where the minority view tends to be the one that doesn't align with the evidence and doesn't align, but there are likely situations in which that's not the case. And so it definitely isn't something that I would say is a blanket one, but something where oftentimes these things slowly happen over time and these norms shift and this social consensus shifts. But yes, it's not always the case that these truth criteria match perfectly onto the objective truth, and also the case with some people may not want to conform. And I think that looking at research on individual differences, and some people may want to engage with conspiracy theories because they want to feel there's some like kind of special group and it's some kind of secretiveness, and they're getting that aspect of it as well. Yeah, so it is a more complicated thing. And these are just more general, but yeah. clearly have to think about that a bit more as well. It's a good question. Yeah. Yes.
Like I noticed a lot of the questions you asked with the tweets and stuff. A lot of them are phrased in like fairly academic language, which feels comfortable probably to everyone in the room, but
Yeah.
not to, like everyone.
Yeah.
Did you look at all like how the wording of that language might change how willing people are to accept it? To a lot of people, or not specifically those questions, but like to a lot of people, like questions like that about like evidence and like
Yeah.
what fact checking kind of kind of packing them.
Yeah. Oh, this is actually a good segue back. So that one question I saw, which was, do other people actually believe that? We looked at which specifically of the truth queries worked best, and that was one that didn't work. So compared to the others. So that's a good question. So I think there's that piece of it. What you didn't see is that in the first couple of studies, actually our replies were more natural. So they actually referred to specific things in the posts and were a bit more varied. In the third study, we did that kind of more straightforward manipulation. But I also think that's a really good question because these do come across as perhaps unnatural. I might expect that the ones that feel more natural I don't have a clear prediction of if I think they would work better or not, but I think that's a really good question to be asking. Yes. Yeah, so in those 3 studies, let's see, in the first studies, or in the first studies, we do have a measure of political orientation. And I did look at it, and I just remember thinking there's nothing exciting here going on. I have to go and double check it now. But I believe what we were finding was with these more neutral claims, we had similar effects across the cross-political orientation. I think there were some minor differences across studies, but generally it seemed like they were working pretty consistently. I think the story might be different depending on if you're using more political information, which is what we're planning to do in our next study, in a lab study, because there is some work in some of the like accuracy nudge and some of those other studies where they're finding that they tend to work better for liberals than for conservatives. But I think a lot of it does depend on context. If you're someone who's taking a study from an academic institution and it's surrounding the specific type of information, you might already at baseline be skeptical and be questioning it more. And so if that's the case, the truth queries may not work as well. So that's another consideration with political orientation, is not just who does it work the best for, but what types of information would it work best for? So if you're already questioning it more is probably, yeah, that's a good question. Yes.
What are the in terms of how information is basically perceived credibility or how information is shared?
I do not have a off the top of head answer for that. Yeah, so our studies, we use like a range of adults. And so in those the first studies, the average age was around 35, but it was a range of ages. And so we just looked across them, but looking at how this varies by age would be a really nice next step. So that's a good question.
In the first study, the people who replied like reference specific and you also mentioned how that people who responded like referencing specific things that might have a stronger effect on the truth queries if they specifically mention things that mention those Jews.
So it's a good question. I feel like there's a number of factors. So some of them would ask, like, what's the evidence for this specifically? So it's a bit more orienting, but I don't know if there would be just kind of an overall effect. My guess is that it might work better for some things compared to others. So with all of these claims, people might have some prior knowledge and kind of some other things to draw on. So my guess it would be a more like kind of complex interaction, but that's I think that would play into it as well. Yeah. Okay, so I think this is the last question because of time, is what I'm getting. And so the question is about what do we know about the truth queries on like the type of truth? And so sometimes things are incorrect information embedded in correct information. That's a really good question. We picked just like true or false, but a lot of studies also do like misleading as a type, where maybe it's technically true. The way I think about work, I'm less concerned about the actual facticity of the information. I'm more concerned with kind of how are people both judging true and false and misleading. And so I think it would depend, yeah, I think it would, my sense is it would work similarly with misleading information as well as true information, but it would depend on people's prior knowledge and kind of other factors as well. But it's a good question. Yeah, I think adding that.
So
Okay.
I think
Yeah.
probably should wrap up. I will note a couple of things in wrapping up today, and that is that there is a reception up on the Sky Bridge where I think Dr. Jalbert will be available for a couple more questions. And I do want to thank the psychology department and all of you for being here today. And I want to thank the Western Washington University Alumni Association for helping support this and the live stream. And for anybody who I think registered for this, that you may get an email with a link to the recorded version of this eventually too. So with that said, I think we should all thank Dr. Jalbert again.